Go
Okay.
ahead.
Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this session that Kathryn Pavlovich is doing on Who and What is God. This is part of a series, a Flamekeeper series of webinars that we've been doing since we started the Flamekeepers group about, I guess it's 2 years ago now.
Maybe
And
four.
so the Flamekeepers is a group that was started, some of the early founders of the MSR group, Management, Spirituality, and Religion group in the Academy of Management. And as the name says, to keep kind of the flame going of the original purpose, why we started the group in the first place. So as again, today's topic is who and what is God? And so here's Kathryn Pavlovich. So Kathryn, take it away.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. That's just a very small Māori karakia just to open the seminar / presentation and to set the energies. So thank you, Jerry, and thank you everyone who are here. The topic today is who and what is God? Now, this certainly isn't something that I would have put my hand up for, but when I was asked to do a Flamekeeper series, this topic just kept coming into my mind. So I knew that clearly it was something I was supposed to do. So I know that many people are going to know and have many more experiences around this than I am. So what I'm just going to do is talk about my personal journey of my own engagement with my spirituality, and also how I've particularly embedded it in my scholarship, which has always been there, even if it's not overt. So just to provide some structure here, I'm going to do my journey from there to here, where I am right now, within 3 sections. And so I'm going to start with where I started, and then move to how I grew. And then most of what I'll be talking about today is where I am today, particularly in relationship to my own experience and my scholarship and how it's woven together. And I guess creating the essence of who I am. Now, the first 2 sections are going to be quite quick, and they will involve breakout groups. So I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say as well, not just my journey. So where I started. Well, I was brought up as a Catholic, and when I look back, I probably had quite well, not a really strict background, but it was probably on the slightly strict side. Things were black and white, and there were very clear boundaries of what you do and what you don't do. My father still talks about me being the age of 2 running away up the road, and he gave me such a smack that I never ever did it again. So that's just kind of an example of some of those very clear boundaries. As a Catholic and going to Catholic schools, I was brought up with this idea of God as quite a stern, but very loving hierarchical male figure. And when we think of God as this person, he is always way above us. And so there's that immediately that separation between the self and the other. Like many people, I think, on the call, regardless of whether you've had a Catholic upbringing or anything else, you've probably been brought up to work really hard, but you're never good enough, but you've got to keep trying harder and harder. And as I reflect back now, it seems somewhat of a paradox, really, but I kind of did buy into it. And lots of Catholic guilt, and I'm sure many of you can relate to that as well. But at the same time, when I look back at that upbringing, there was a lot of certainty around what you should and shouldn't do. You know, the black and whiteness was quite good to be brought up with. but it was also very, so there was certainty, but it was always very deterministic in that you always had something to aim for. You know, this idea of trying to be as good as God, you have to work hard, you know, and I know that a lot of the female professors I meet always have that Catholic background. I think we are a way higher percentage than other people are. So just in summary of where I started, there was this sense of never been good enough, but always got to try really hard. Very clear boundaries of what's expected and what isn't expected. And so with that in mind, I'm just going to turn it over to you and ask you for the first breakout group, please, Paul. How do you understand God and what does God mean to you? So I'm going to suggest that we stay in breakout groups for 10 minutes and then have 5 minutes feeding back. So clearly we're not going to be able to hear everybody's views, but we will hear some of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. And I might have missed it. How long did you want the breakouts to go, Kathryn?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, perfect. Off you go, enjoy.
Right. Trying to share my screen. I seem to have lost my screen.
There you go.
Excellent. I think everyone is back now. So we have 5 minutes just to hear anyone's views around this question. How do you understand God and what does God mean to you?
And feel free to raise your digital Zoom hand in the reactions tab at the bottom, or drop a quick note in the chat if you want to speak, or just unmute.
Yes, Ellen.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm glad to be here and thanks for you being here. Well, since nobody think, I think it's difficult to understand God if it is not impossible. So maybe that is the reason most of people are silent, because God is beyond understanding, intellect, reasoning, according to the little knowledge that I have. Because all our knowledge is based on information passing through senses to us and processes which is being predetermined in our brain according to the journey we came from here through millions of years of evolution. So perhaps it is not easy to understand it. So, and in the group, we have discussed about, with Maza and Ken about different, how in Japan they are looking at nature as a god, and in some Hindu tradition or Catholic tradition as a father or as a idols, perhaps because God is everywhere, God is in everything. So that was our chat and discussion. So I wanted to share with you. Yeah. Thank you for everyone.
Thank you, Ellen. I think Judy and Jerry both have your hands up.
Jerry,
Judy, go ahead.
well, Jerry was first.
Oh, okay.
All right. Well, our group, we had 2 Catholics and me, 2 Catholics and a Jew. One of the observations were how similar the 2 religions are, and one reason is, of course, because Jesus was Jewish, Also, the high holiday services are very similar to a Catholic Mass. Large part of it is basically the same. But the other point is that I want to make is that I think that all religions start off with a mystical experience. And so there's the mystical experience, and then there's the codification of the experience down the line by other people. And it seems to me anyway, from my own experience that I've had and from talking to other people, the mystical experience seems to cut across, to be very similar across all religions, Western, Eastern, whatever. It's more the interpretation of the experience where these kinds of discussions, religious discussions, come about. So when I think of God, I think, to me, my experience is more like the Force, like in Star Wars, you know.
Thank you, Jerry. Judy.
The force be with you. In our group, Regina Bento started off by quoting Parker Palmer, which apparently she did that with you, Kathryn, yesterday. And I wrote down one phrase that really struck me, that God is the source of reality, not morality. And a lot of what she had to say was that this source, this God, wants us to be fully who we are, not some idealized self. And I think one of the themes that came out in our small group with Charlie Tackney and Regina and myself was that the more we're on the path, not only the less we understand God, but the less we try to understand God.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Tom, we've got 1 minute.
Okay, so we had Deborah and Lakshmi, and I'll say we actually didn't talk about what is God. What we talked about was the rituals that each community participates in and reminds us of the presence of something that's greater than ourselves. I think that was really the theme of our conversation. And each, community has different rituals. Some have more than others, but they are very meaningful and often are metaphorical representations of the expectations that divinity has for us. Whether it doesn't really matter what tradition it originates from, but it has messages for us in terms of how to live our lives. I think that's captures what we talked about.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. And I know that, if we could hear from everyone, we'd have such a rich diversity of experiences and a depth of understanding that we just simply don't have the opportunity to go into. And I'm also aware that some religions don't even talk about this thing called God because it's just too mystical and too beyond our comprehension. It's just some sort of latency that's there. So yes, so fascinating. I just want to move on now from there, where I started, to how I grew, my own touch points and roadblocks, which of course, we all have. So being a very good Catholic girl, I got married way too young to my childhood sweetheart, the age of 19. Oh my gosh. And then I got divorced when I had 3 preschool age children, when my husband, who ran off with his nurse, wonderful doctor and nurse things, but actually, although it felt extremely painful at the time, I look back now and I think, what a gift. Who would I have become had I stayed a doctor's wife? And I suspect very judgmental, because this was a black and white world, and oh my gosh, I'm so glad I'm not that person. I hope I've developed into being a much, much better person for that. So, these roadblocks, as we've all had, can all turn into touch points to enable us to grow. And of course, there've been many more than I've just put down here, but I won't go into those. But as many of you know, my husband, my second husband, unexpectedly died nearly 2 years ago. And since that time, I feel as all my assumptions have been up for grabs. It feels as if I've literally been turned upside down by my feet and shaken, and everything is down on the floor to have to be revisited. So a huge amount of unlearning for me around some of my assumptions and my beliefs and all those things that I can't even imagine. You can't even imagine how significant many of these experiences have been. So again, the roadblock, which was extremely painful and unexpected, turning into touch points. And finally, from where I was, after that, I did go back to university and eventually did my PhD in collaborative organizing, which is what I will go on to talk about shortly, in the way that I tried to challenge some of the strategy assumptions that everything was based on competitive dynamics. I just never quite got that. Don't understand competitive dynamics. And I remember applying for a job somewhere and I said I didn't understand how competition was at the core of what we do. In every other animal kingdom, cooperation is at the core with a little bit of competition on the side. And someone came up to me from the panel afterwards and said, "Don't ever say that ever again." Anyway, this is what motivated me to do a PhD, the hat. And no one believes me, but actually it really was. I wanted the PhD hat. And I could have just gone and bought one, but always take the hard route. People don't believe me, but I just think that the universe works in mysterious ways. And clearly I was supposed to do a PhD. And if that's what motivated me, well, c'est la vie. So I want to go back into breakout groups again, and you know, how did your touch points enable you to grow? So again, we'll go away for 10 minutes and then we'll spend 5 minutes just talking together. Thanks, Paul.
It's a little one, baby. That's fine. It's got it.
Right, is everybody back?
I believe so.
Believe so. Okay, let's have 5 minutes of reflecting on this part of the conversation of how did your touch points enable you to grow? And if no one wants to share, that's fine as well. Clearly, these are quite personal conversations.
Anil, go ahead.
Yes, actually, you're right, Kathryn. This is a very provocative topic, and these conversations are very personal. We sort of began to say it's personal. Should we share or not? In fact, sometimes we said that. It took a little moment to come out of it. But then I think that in the summary, if I could sort of, this is the idea that we are, this is not a linear path, sort of, it is all what people would call sort of critical incidents, and they could be of various types. Somebody watching you, or divorces. Divorces came up in this one with the other two people. I think this was Bill and Deborah. And then I think my insight was that there's almost everywhere when we saw this, at each incident, everybody was getting out of the box, either expanding the box or, you know, somehow breaking out of the box. And the premise for me was that somehow early in our life, we get put into a box, and then we spend the rest of our life breaking out of that box or expanding.
I love that. Thank you.
Sam, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just briefly, our conversation, I think Tom Cullum in his talk reminded me of something. I do think we grow up with a lot of predetermination thinking and how things are in the world. And that there are events that open things up. And while I've been talking about other ones, I began being trained in improv and theatrical improv. And the lesson of being open, the yes and being listening, and was transformative for me in being able to take other experiences in my life and understanding them differently. And I've been talking about, there were, the points I was thinking of before this were the moments of being with people as they died. We've had a lot of experiential experiences with loss in the and that brings you to mean life. But I realized that the theatrical piece, or the improv piece, the ability to get up and just listen and be, was more important to me about opening up and being able to understand and see the world differently as anything else. So I thought
Okay. Thank you for those. Can everyone see my screen? I seem to have lost.
Catherine, Eric has his hand up as well if there's time.
Yes, certainly.
Oh, I'm just provoked by the last two speakers to share that I guess it's periods or points of deep joy and bliss, of deep conflict and pain, and of deep pressure to move forward would be some of the ways my touchstones have provoked me to go beyond the box. One, deep nature, one is just so beautiful, and expansion, one through conflict saying, I can't stay with my beliefs, and the other being a moment of saying, you're here to talk about this, and you have to, or you're gonna die. And so that was sort of the underlying themes in my touchstones.
Thank you. Beautiful way to move into a different energies. And
Vikram has his hand up too.
Okay, we're probably going to have to wait and pick those comments at the end, and hopefully we've got some time at the end as well. But from where I'm sitting, as I'm listening to people, I feel a softening as well, which is really lovely to be part of. So I wanted to move from the first two sections to where I am today. And my understanding of this notion of, or energy of God, is around the geometry of divinity. And I very much want to talk about how I got to that space through my own experience / very much through my scholarship, and how my scholarship has very much informed the journey of where I am today. And I'm going to talk about 3 different paths that I have taken to get there. And the first one was my PhD that I did to get my hat, which was around the evolution and transformation of a tourism destination. Now, about an hour from where I live here in Hamilton, New Zealand's top tourism destination is only an hour away. So it seemed the obvious place to go and do data collection, as I wanted to critique these competitive dynamic models and look at the nature of collaboration. So this has been a tourism destination for, well, gosh, probably nearly 130 years now. And you go down to these caves, Whitewall Caves, and you get into the boat and you travel through the underground streams. And up in the sky, you can see these glowworms, which are like looking at stars in the sky. And it's quite an amazing, magical experience, unless you happen to go there with 30 other coachloads of people. And for 100 years, it was just a single short destination where you'd go there for an hour and then you'd go out. But in the 1980s and 1990s, we got a huge increase in free and independent travelers to New Zealand. And so there are different type of activities were developed around here, such as blackwater rafting, where you get a rubber tube and you go down through the cave waters, which is really cool, or abseiling into the cave, 100-meter abseil, and a whole lot of other things. So you've got this nucleus of this small destination being formed over the last 20 to 30 years. Now, this is a really small, simple community. There's only 300 people that live there, but 500,000 people come through in terms of visitations. And so people that do these blackwater rafting trips, for instance, they need accommodation, they need food, they need other sorts of support systems. So you've got this small cluster of organizations being formed. And you can see down here on the right-hand side, you can see some of the 20 to 30 coaches / buses that line up each day.
We can't see your PowerPoint.
Judy, you're
Yes.
not sharing your screen.
You mean Kathryn?
I mean, Kathryn, excuse me.
I'm not sharing my screen. Okay. Thank you.
No trouble.
How is that?
There you go.
There I
Um,
go.
That's the whole screen. You want to start your presentation to get it. There you go. Perfect.
There I go. So this, just spend a few minutes here. This is the Whitewall Caves with these really cool things to do. And this is the small, very simple destination. And I just wanted to point out on the left-hand side, you know, back then, IT has made such a difference, but back then they really did take photos of their visitors and put the film on the legs of pigeons who would actually fly back and they would be developed. So, you know, some really cool stuff that goes on there. However, I got a number of publications from this work, and you can see that mainstream journals, but not all mainstream things, like All That Jazz and A Fractal Approach to Network Transformation. But the one I really want to focus on is the last one, the rhizomic approach to terrorism, decimation, evolution, and transformation. And you know, as you look back over your academic career, there's always a couple of pieces of work that you're really proud of and you love. Well, this is one of mine. This is, it was really difficult to get published, but I really love this piece of work that I did. I'm proud of this one. And so just to summarize it very briefly, and I hope I can explain it well, but I'm looking at this notion of organization and the non-linear forms of how organization works. And I've used this Deleuze concept of a rhizomic approach. So if you think of a piece of ginger, which of course is a rhizome, you know, you can't start in any prefixed place. You can start anywhere through this piece of ginger. It's temporal. You can break bits off, they can start again, and they can come together in different ways. So there's this non-linear aspect to it. If again you think of that metaphor, organized connections can occur anywhere amongst those organizations. So if you come into the tourism destination, you might have food first, you might do an adventure first. There's no right way of doing things. But there was this density and intensity of connections amongst the different organizations that started to happen in the last 20 years that weren't there previously. And they were really they were instrumental in building these network capabilities, or I call them multiplicities there. And so I started to see that this notion of energy, everything exists, but it's the nature of the connections that actually make that latency into actualization. So I started to see God no longer as this hierarchy, but as energy. An empty space is not just empty, it's fiery, entangled energy that just waiting to be expressed. So it's this concept of being volume filled. All possibilities are there, but how can we create them? It's dependent on the nature of the connections that we have between each other. So guess what? After doing 4 years plus on my PhD, I learned that, do unto others as you wish to be done to yourself. And I kind of thought, wow, that was a really long, circuitous journey to find out that actually the nature of organizing really is about how kind we are to each other. Being kind is an energy. So although I wasn't into quantum physics at this point, you can see that this language is starting to inform my thinking around that everything is possible. But that's those values of being kind to each other that become really important. Does that make sense? Does anyone have a question? Okay, great, thank you. Let me move into my second pathway, sacred geometry. So in many ways, these were happening in tangent, but they are quite different, different pathways. And I haven't published this particular work on sacred geometry, but it's kind of cool. And I always think that when I retire and I have all this free time, I'll be able to engage in those things. Those of you that are retired will know that doesn't happen like that. And so those of you that know about sacred geometry, it is the blueprint of creation and the genesis of everything that we know. It's around the energy patterns that create and unify all things. And every natural pattern of growth conforms to some of these geometrical shapes. So it's very much the relationship between the whole and the parts and how those parts create and volume fill this whole. And on the right-hand side, I understand this is an that has been toned into a drop of oil and photographed in some way. And you will see that it picks up this flower of life form. Now, the flower of life is seen through all of creation. And if you go back to some of the ancient rock carvings in Egypt and Syria, and some of our indigenous cultures, and I have heaps of photos around these, they all have this flower of life pattern. Well, please look on the right-hand side. So when I was doing this research, I tried to visualize it as a cluster, you know, Michael Porter's cluster with the core firms right in the middle there, the pink firms, then the supporting firms, then the soft infrastructure, and then the hard infrastructure. So I used the circular model based on E4 Williams' work rather than some sort of linear approach to cluster theory, which many people do. And as I was starting to get into the sacred geometry, I realized, oh my gosh, I had drawn that just like the flower of life. That was not intentional. That just happened. How did that happen? That was crazy. And then a number of things happened. And then I looked at those core firms right in the middle. And when I take, which become the seed of life, and there are those core firms. And then we see it's a tetrahedron. And certainly that is quite important in the Jewish religion. And also, if you know Emoto's work on water, where he somehow is able to capture these images of water based on the divinity that's within them, it comes up in the same form. So it's not that it means anything, but it means everything to know that there are these sacred patterns underlying all of creation. And then again, trust me, one of the capabilities within this tourism destination network was having to look after the karst environment. And so you've got this big grouping of organizations that come together just to look after this. And again, I drew it like this. And one day I just happened to come across something and it said, Pentagon Design. When cut out and folded, it makes a three-dimensional pentagon dodecahedron. And it's like I don't know what this means, but there are energy patterns within this world, and it just signifies the perfection of the cosmos, and how as we shift our understanding from this rational deterministic understanding of what organization is, there is something a lot more fiery and interesting going on. So as Regina said yesterday, I am that I am, Aya Esha Aya. The spiritual
Somebody's talking to me.
underlies everything. Any time for one question? Okay, let me move on now to my third aspect of scholarship, which is getting closer to where I am now. So some 20 years ago, I met this delightful man, Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon. And when I show this photo, I always say I have touched stardust, because it's a pretty cool experience to meet someone who's been to the moon. Anyway, like many astronauts, as he came back from the moon, as you do, he said he had what could only be described as a transcendental experience. Every time he looked out the window and he saw Earth, he would start to cry, and he could not. It was completely overwhelming. And he felt an awe of this beautiful planet Earth that we call home. And the key thing, he said, he understood that the science and the religion that he was taught and grew up with was not the complete story. So he spent the rest of his life developing this Institute of Noetic Sciences to look at this relationship between science and consciousness. And I know, I think it was last year, Chris, we had Dean Radin from this institute as a plenary speaker at Academy. So isn't that so cool to be able to see that this shift is going on? I think it was Jeff Bezos who's just taken his rocket up into space as well. I think he had such a similar experience. I read the other day where he saw this Earth as this very fragile, sacred place. So clearly going up and seeing Earth from a magnitude does change us significantly. And so the work that I'm currently engaged with around quantum physics very much is seeing God as an entanglement. You know, it's all about love, guys. I know when I was chair of MSR and got some speakers ready for the plenary, one of the strategy gurus said, you know, I can't say this in many environments, but actually good leadership depends on how much you love your people. It's very simple. So it's all about love and vibrational frequency. And this really, certainly in my work around rhizomes, but particularly now, this relationship between energy and materiality is very much starting to come to the fore. And so my second paper that I'm most proud of is my quantum empathy paper, which, my gosh, got really, really harsh reviews. They really pushed me to the limit with this one. And just a plug, it hasn't been cited very often. There's free access if you want to read it at the moment. I kind of am proud of this one. And so in this paper, I have argued that contemplative practice has the ability to intensify this energy and materiality in some form, this volume filling connections that we can have. And there's a point of coherence, and certainly quantum physicists start to talk about this point of coherence where we can actually be together as one. Most of you will know about mirror neurons or empathy neurons. And in feeling and experiencing another's pain and joy, it becomes our own, forming an interconnected confluence. So for me, this is a remarkable shift in our science, because you don't just have to have the experience. You can feel each other's pain just by talking it through with each other. So it means that there's something else going on here. You know, it's not just the materiality. There is this vibrational frequency, or what I call this quantum empathy, where you are actually feeling another person's pain within some sort of vibrational or coherent pattern. And I know most of you will have had that experience of thinking of somebody, and then you haven't seen them for ages, but then suddenly they phone you or they see them in the street. I mean, we can't explain that through some sort of rational science, but it can be explained at that vibrational frequency where you are emitting some sort of thought process and it is connecting in some way. And so I'm suggesting in this paper that empathy does more than enhance pro-social behavior. It creates a shared experience which holds the possibility of creating a new social order. As we feel, we connect and we become entangled in some way. So as Merleau-Ponty says, confirms that we were thinking of space as some sort of ether in which things float about, but rather we need to think of it as a universal power enabling them to be connected. And hence at the subatomic level, matter is an entanglement of excitable interconnected energy with a field of continuous flux and constantly exchanging information. Oh, I love this. This is so exciting. Now, the really fascinating thing is that when we look at the Christian worldview of this Holy Spirit, it's described as a superhuman form, a supernatural form that can communicate across time and space. Well, that sounds really like entanglement to me. And here is a definition of entanglement. So in many ways, I've started to come full circle. And in some of the ways, some of my experiences and teaching of Catholicism actually have a different meaning that's far more present and livable for me now. And so my journey from there to here is based on the geometry of divinity. And I just give thanks to my Ellie McMurtry, who only came into my life briefly, but she made a very powerful impact on me around this concept of geometry of divinity. And as I came to imbue that concept, it became, as I said just before, a lot more livable for me. So I now see from my Catholicism, God as transcendent. Yes, there's this hierarchy, but I see it in terms of the space to grow to and to expand from. God is energy. It's all about connection and touching each other in different ways, you know, through this aspect of being kindness and being in love. And God is as entanglement through this geometry of divinity. So, are there questions before we go into a breakout group? Okay, so we'll go into our third breakout group. I think
Vikram has his hand raised.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Vikram.
Yeah, sure, Kathryn. So the question I had, and this is related to the second breakout we had, where we were talking about what kind of led us down the journey. And in some ways, each one of us had some sort of cathartic events, and more often than not, they were nudges alternated with reflection, right? Smaller nudges, which were then became sort of reflective turning points, smaller turning points. But why do some people do this? Why do the 30 of us are sitting here in MSR, and there could be similar 30 or 300 or 3,000 who are not? Each one of them went through a similar process of nudges. Why does it happen to few and not to others? Or it's not coming from a point of view of being unique, but what is different?
You're asking me to explain that? I mean, everyone gets the nudges.
Right. And why do some people react in a particular way and some don't?
It's a very good question.
Come on, Kathryn, you ask us such difficult questions. We should be able to ask you difficult ones too.
And again, I'm not coming from a point of view of saying that I mean, there has to be something more than just chance, right? Because if it was chance, then randomness exists, but randomness is not, I mean, that cannot be the organizing principle, right?
So I was told, and well, it's been true in my life. I've been told that the universe gives us 3 significant turning points. And if you don't acknowledge them after the 3rd, you're allowed to have a pleasant life. That sounds a little judgmental, actually. It doesn't kind of, I don't know, maybe it's your karma not necessarily to become that aware in some lives. You know, I mean, and then again, I have a very good girlfriend and she says, you know, I live an ordinary life, but in an extraordinary way. So I don't know if we can necessarily prescribe or judge what other people's
and where I was going with this, where I was going with this, Kathryn, was really answered in your second part, the quantum aspect of it. Because in the quantum, if you think of it from a quantum perspective, reality is being generated every instant. I mean, it's literally, you are what you think, you are what you perceive, you are what you believe. You know, there's a co-creation aspect of it. So in some ways, those nudges were sort of in a weird science fiction manner, were sort of portals to other realities that we kind of created along that path to lead us to the lived reality now. Each nudge is perhaps a quantum event. It's a point of inflection where the wave function collapses to only emerge as something different. I don't know. I'm trying to connect the first part of your conversation with the second, because if you apply quantum, then that's really where you come up with, right?
Mm. I love that. I can see Cherry has got her hand up as well.
And Shadrach as well.
Yes.
Yeah, hello. I'm just thinking that in relation, I've just chipped in relation to Vikram's questions about like why different people reacted differently to the nudges. I think that's I mean, like, I'm a Catholic myself, and I believe that God has given us each of the humanity a free will, so we can exercise our free will as to, you know, each of the persons may have different. That's why each of the persons will have different reactions to the nudges. So yeah, I think that's that's the free will that God's been graced to us, in my opinion and my understanding.
Oops.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cherry.
Yeah.
Kathryn, do you want to proceed with Shadrach, or?
Yes, please. I've just lost my screen here, so.
You're
yes.
good. Go ahead, Shadrach.
Thank you. No, it wasn't actually. I was going to address is it Vikram's question, interesting question. This is no explanation, but it just reminded me of one of the ancient spiritual teachers who said that only those with a magnetic center will answer the call and take up the spiritual path. I don't even know what that means, but it just came to me as you asked the question, Vikram.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
It's really lovely. Are there any other questions? Because we can go into a breakout group for 7 minutes, or we can just open the floor for a broader discussion.
Let's do a quick.
Okay. Right. So my question now is,
I've got it in the chat, Kathryn.
what does your understanding of this concept of God mean for you and our theorizing of MSR?
Questions in the chat? Off we go. Enjoy.
Okay, we just have a few moments left, so let's hear some thoughts, please. I guess the first thing I will say is it's hard. Smitta.
So in our group, Kathryn, we were talking about how we grapple with the idea of theorizing, because it kind of, the underlying connotation felt like we're still trying to understand God from a place of intellect and rational, logical mind, where it has to be, that's what ends up being the block, at least in my journey, that it's going beyond the rational intellectual mind to know God. So we grappled with the term theorizing in our breakout group.
I can totally understand that. Yes. Thank you, Smitta.
We have Jerry, then Vikram, then Judy, and any other voices, particularly those we haven't heard from, please raise your hand. Jerry.
Yes, well, what Smita just said is something similar that came up in our group. Most theorizing and most of what happens in the academy in general seems to be based on a model that doesn't include, that leaves out the spiritual, which gets to the whole point about, thinking about, if God is energy or whatever these things are. It doesn't usually come up in the mechanistic model behind which most of the research methodology that has been used in the academy, which is based largely off psychology methodology, is based on. And so maybe this is a way in which MSR, maybe we can be helpful in contributing or thinking about other ways and other research methods that do involve some of these other techniques that don't usually get mentioned.
Thank you, Jerry.
Judy.
I'm left with a question, and that question is, what would my research be like if God was my co-author?
Whoa.
Much easier.
Free to all.
Yes. I'm going to come back to you on the answer to that at some point in the future, Judy.
Thank you, Judy.
There might be only one author because it's one and the same.
Yes. Yes.
I'm reminded partly because Dan Harris is here, and so I'm pleased to see him. And the conference that we organized, Dan and Judy and myself, the 5th MSR conference in Fayetteville, the best paper, you may remember, best paper presentation went to a PhD student who discussed how one's concept of God affects their perception of what is a good leader or good manager, which to me made a lot of sense. So just this is the direct answer to the question: how does the concept of God help us theorize MSR?
Thank you.
Alan, did you still have a comment or? Your hand went back down.
Well, I was not sure, but since you invited me, thanks. I will speak about two previous comments about the free will, which came out, and another topic. I think if we have free will, then basically we should be able to do everything. But it is clear that we cannot do everything because the structure around us does not allow us. So in a sense that our free will work inside what science calls structure and what spirituality called God's will. So they work together. That's what I want to suggest through my little knowledge. And about this theorizing, I think theorizing, no matter how well it's done, continue to be theory, because basically it depends on worldview and some information, and information is changing all the time. So the theories are also changing all the time. But there is one opinion and view that truth is truth and cannot change. So in this sense, the truth can be experienced through inner senses, and it is, and truth and God and love are one, and we have to, through enlightenment and through this path, to answer the question, not to the real one and last question for truth, which is who am I? And through that, we can get all the other answers. Otherwise, through theorizing, we have one theory saying that this side is better, this side is worse, and another theory come and build on exactly the opposite. And this is a never changing game. For thousands of years, philosophers were arguing, and none of one single argument is approved or disproved, or proved to be false or proved to be true. This is my understanding. Thank you for giving me time.
Thank you, Ellen. Kathryn, we have 1 minute, and Tom
Yes.
and Lee have their hands up. It's in your hand.
So what I'm going to do is just to finish the presentation. I just want 2 more slides, and then if people do want to stay just with Tom and Lee, let's go ahead. I'm kind of always like to finish on time, that's all. I just wanted to finish with this wonderful little clip from Arundhati Roy, and she says, another world is on her way, and on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. So kia kaha ora ha. Thank you so much for participating in this and being here to listen to my journey, and also for raising some very, very thought-provoking comments. So thank you. And I'm now happy to stay on and listen to Tom and Lee and have a short discussion, but I know many people will need to leave. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kathryn.
Thank you.
So Tom, Lee, I'm not sure who had their hands up first.
I can, whatever, I can go. I think one of the things that the insights I had from your whole presentation was that if you think of your journey, your personal journey, at the start, your conception of God was very narrow, black and white, vindictive, punishing. I don't know, maybe I've got that wrong, but I guess it's Catholic theology.
Stern. I said stern but loving. Stern but loving.
Stern but loving. Okay. But there was a certain conception, theory of what God is.
Yes.
That's theology, right? Theology.
Yes.
And your life experience has shifted your understanding of divinity. and you have another theory now. And I guess the way I see it is theory is the finger pointing at the moon. It is not the moon, but the shift in your theory has enabled a much broader experience of divinity, and maybe perhaps as a pointer for other people. So there is some value in theory, and there's in the shift that you've described for yourself, I think is really helpful for others. And so even though theory might be an obstacle to knowing the divine, if you keep in mind what its purpose is, then maybe it isn't. So that's all I just had in mind to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. And Tom, yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. And sorry, I'm totally digressing, but Paul, I meant to say thank you in front of everyone, and it's just slipped my mind. My apologies. Really appreciate your help with this.
You're fine. It's my pleasure, Kathryn.
Yes. So going back to you, Tom, yes, it's all about experience, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. And that your experience has shifted your understanding of divinity and helped you develop a much more expansive, broader theory.
Yeah. Thank you.
And it's not likely to be the limit, right?
Well, hopefully I've got a few more years, yes. I'm sure there'll be a few more roadblocks, but
yeah.
Lee.
Thank you.
So there's a huge downside as well to some of these kinds of conceptions of God, which arose for me, thinking about it, in the description of God as co-author. So if God is co-author, what I am writing and saying is revelation, and you need to do what I say, as they pointed out in the Spanish Inquisition, among many other places. So there's an issue. I'm not sure how to resolve it, but it's certainly not true.
Whoops, I think we've lost you, Lee.
Yeah, his internet can go down.
Did you not hear what I said?
No.
Can you hear me?
Just the last sentence or so, Lee.
The Spanish Inquisition cut you off.
Yes, so there's, I don't know what's wrong with this thing. So there's a huge downside, prospectively, to this. And the Spanish Inquisition is one example of that, but there's Ireland, the 30 Years' War, one could just go on and on and on, because if I am in touch with God, and God is, so this is part of the delicacy of the concept, the supreme being, then what I am saying to you is what you must do, and if you don't, you must be eliminated.
Yeah. I'm not sure how to respond to that, but I know the first comment that you made about being downloaded and channeled, certainly my Flamekeeper people know that one morning I had no intention of getting up and writing the poster and stuff for this talk, but it just happened, and it just happened within 10 minutes. You know, sometimes we're just pushed to do these things in certain ways and certain times. That partly responds to your comment, Lee. And we've got Judy and Jerry and Eric. Whoever wants to be first, I don't mind.
Why don't I go, because Lee was responding to my comment about God as co-author. And the way I think about it is there are levels of relationship to God and levels of conception of God. And so, Kathryn, your first level was God as stern but loving.
Yes.
And there are some levels below that, I would say vibrationally, of stern and punishing. At least you didn't have to go through that, but some people do. And I do think there's a difference between war and doing research. So is God as my co-general versus God as my co-author. But I hear, Lee, the concern of using God for destructive means that cause suffering in the earth, and I don't support that. But I think if God is a field of energy and it's based on love and kindness, then that we can tap into that to guide our research questions, to guide our writing, to guide our creating of a poster for a presentation, and we need to be the clearest, most loving channel for that to come through, and we may not be, and we may cause harm. So it just depends on where we are and how we see God and how much of our ego is in it versus being of service.
Paul, I'm not quite sure how long, if you've got a time frame for this. I can stay probably another 10 minutes, but I have another meeting, unfortunately. I'd much prefer to be here with Dan. It's such a long time since I've seen you, and Trish, and all you wonderful people.
10 minutes is fine, Kathryn, and this is a great conversation. So
yes.
Happy to keep the recording going and the conversation. Jerry, I believe you're next.
Well, just continuing the discussion that's been going on, there is, at least in several different traditions, there's the idea of searching around for the treasure and finding out the treasures in your own basement, which is another way of saying, I remember there was a series of books based on the phrase, be still and know that I am God, which sometimes gets interpreted as be still and know that I am God, which is another way of saying that God is within each of us, which gets to the point I think that Lee was raising, which is how do we react? How does a person react when they have that experience of God being within them? And I guess it relates to what Judy says too. On one level, you could say, okay, well, theoretically, I accept that God is within me. Or you might have had a really deep mystical experience that God, of God. Then the question is, what happens when you have that really deep mystical experience, which many times is turned into one religion fighting another religion, even though they all started off with the same experience, taking that experience and codifying it into laws, and this is how you should act, and this is what you should do, and my experience is different than your experience, and mine is better than yours, gets into all the things that Lee was talking about. But I think at the purest level, the experience that most mystics have had is one of love. And so oftentimes between having the experience and trying to explain it to someone else, we get into these problems. And how that might translate into theorizing is another thing. I think, those people that are really into like yoga and all that stuff, where they talk about the body is the temple, and we're a spiritual person undergoing a human experience. I mean, there are so many levels, like Judy said, that I think it really is, it comes down to how we interpret the experience that we have. All theorizing ends up being based on our own way of taking that experience. Hope that makes some sense.
Thank you. Eric.
I'd like to go back to sort of what I heard as three core principles that you talked about, of principles of God, if you will, or descriptors. One was relationship, the second was interconnectivity, and the third was energy. And I hope I do you justice there, Kathryn. My field of study has been 40 years of how do we create change in the world. And I was a co-founder 40 years ago this month of something called the Blue Box program, which helped transform recycling in Canada and around the world. And what I have just done a paper on it, and I found that essentially the three core principles that you were describing were what we use to transform the state of recycling. It was, and it was struck me as we had to change our beliefs, not to impose our beliefs on others and try to convince them to change, but engage them and empower them to say what's essentially is the God within wanting to do in your life. It was called, you can make a difference. Another piece was joining across sectoral boundaries instead of being siloed in nonprofit, for-profit, and government. We had to cross non-traditional sectors and relate and see the interconnectedness, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to make this happen. And so those three, and also the third you pointed to, Judy has, Jerry just did, is love instead of fear. Don't tell people about the fear that if you don't, what will happen. We embraced love of all of the actors in the process, saw them as partners, and tried to say, so what is in your interests? Not just what's in our interests, and impose, which has been a traditional religious spiritual approach, is I've got the answer, you should do it, as Lee was pointing to, instead of saying, how do we help you to come forward and be more in your world and in your life? And this might be one way to contribute to changing the world. So thank you for your core principles. And I think they do apply to theorizing how management will be done in the future.
Thank you, Eric. That's a lovely way of actually being able to bring it together. Yeah, it's cool. And that very applied practical aspect. Yeah. And I think we have one last person with their hand up, and then we probably need to close off.
Again,
Alan,
Alan, you had your hand up, but you took it down in either way.
Okay, I saw that time finished because she had 10 minutes. But yeah, very quickly, very, very nice and interesting discussion. Thanks for everybody for organizing. About experience, Jerry spoke about how difficult and problematic when trying to give your experience to somebody else, because what is discussion is through language and intellect, which is limited, so experience cannot be shifted, and that's why all these kind of sharing is through duality, separation. And according to my humble understanding, God is about union and oneness. In that sense, when we are talking about co-author, basically God is a co-author. He is the author, he is a paper, he is a publication, and he's a thought and processes and everything. So there will be no conflict in this sense. Otherwise, if he's my co-author, then competition will start, because my paper is different from other paper. And so the duality will start. So this is what I wanted to add to the concept of this experience and intellect in one side, and co-author and being the author on the other side. Yeah. Once again, thank you so much. Yeah.
And a good way for us to end the session. So thank you so much. Thanks everyone for staying for an even more stimulating conversation at the end. I appreciate that. And thanks for your time. We're all so busy and trying to juggle all these different things, so appreciate it.
Yes, we end up with a real club, Kathryn. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you, Paul, for organizing
Thank you, Paul. Yeah.
again.